Hello and welcome back to another update. This is a massive, crazy update as Russians have launched a massive offensive in the Vuhledar sector of the front line direction of Kursk. We also see changes in the Kursk region and in the Selydove River direction. Looking in the Vuhledar section of the front line, the Russians have launched several assaults in the north of the Kashlahag river line towards Shakhtarsk in the west, in the direction of Novokrainka from the Selydove direction, and in the direction of Vuhledar. At the same time, the Russians have also launched operations here to the west of Vuhledar, flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. In the northern direction, the Russians have managed to capture a large portion of Hrynik, leaving about half under Russian control and half under Ukrainian control. The Russians are also storming Kremenna from the east and from the north, attacking along the fortified positions and the forest lines near the settlement. The Russians have also managed to gain a foothold in Novodmitrivka here along the road, capturing the northern parts of the road along Selydove. Within Selydove, the Russians have made several advances here as well, capturing the southeastern parts of the settlement, leaving only the western parts in a gray zone, meaning the southern parts of the Selydove direction has fallen, and the Ukrainian forces remaining within Selydove is in the northern parts, mostly around the apartment complex areas, which the Russians have made a significant advance within as well. Further north, the Ukrainians made a counterattack to recapture one of the waste heaps here in the direction of Krutyi Yar and the northeastern outskirts of Novhrodivka. Further north here in the direction of Terny, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the northern outskirts of the settlement, storming the settlement from Novosadove. Finally, in the Kursk direction, there's been some map updates in the direction of Derino and Nikolaevo Derino. At the same time, the Russians have been able to secure Novoivanovka and Seleny from the Ukrainian counterattacks from the south and the north. The Ukrainians attempted a combined strike from the northern and southern direction to regain control over Novoivanovka and Seleny, but the Russians have managed to withstand those offensive operations so far, securing both settlements and holding the Ukrainian army at bay within the pocket in the northern direction and their push in the southern direction. So we see the front line being formed along the river line and heavy fighting along the settlements in the center. Returning to the southern direction to get a lot more information about the Russian advances here, we have a lot of geolocated footage and a lot of combat footage with regards to the offensive operations. Ahead of the Russians storming Shakhtarsk and Vuhledar, there was this massive shelling of both settlements, as we see in the following footage. Based on the footage we can see, ahead of the Russian storming of these settlements, there was massive shelling on both of them. This allowed the Russians to launch offensive operations to capture fortified positions north of Selydove and move along the road all the way to the outskirts of Shakhtarsk. At the same time, they launched additional offensive operations towards Novokrainka from the west to keep the Ukrainian forces here in the southern direction, and combined it with an assault in the east, again with the cover of heavy fire on Vuhledar, with artillery covering the entirety of the settlement, to reach the outskirts of that as well, capturing the fortified positions ahead of it. Getting a closer look at the settlements, we see that Shakhtarsk is separated by a river line in the south, where the Russians have gained control over the farm areas south of the river line and moved to the western outskirts of the settlement to cut off the connection between Shakhtarsk and Velika Novosilka. According to the Deep State map update, the Russians managed to reach the western outskirts and then move in the direction of Velika Novosilka, but following heavy fire from the Ukrainians, they turned back towards Shakhtarsk, where they do not claim that the Russians have gained control of the farm area and southern parts, but based on the information, it is clear that the Russians dropped off infantry both in the western parts and in the southern outskirts of Shakhtarsk, where the objective is to cut off the supplies, set up some ambushes, and disconnect Shakhtarsk from Velika Novosilka, cutting off the direct connection, to then start a siege over the settlement itself following the heavy bombardment of it. This will allow the Russians to then move in the northern direction towards Yasna Polyana and to flank Novokrainka from the western flank. Combined with the assaults in the direction of Vuhledar, capturing the fortified positions south of the settlement allows the Russians to now have a direct supply route through Boyavlenka and start the siege of that settlement as well. And similarly, the Russians set up positions in the western outskirts of the settlement to cut off its connection with other settlements. So we see that the Russians are here starting a foothold in both of these settlements to fight over both of them and to flank Novoukrayinka from both the eastern and western directions, cutting it off from the north and completely encircling it, isolating the settlement from everywhere else. At the same time, there's some ending attacks on the fortified positions as well as the general area around Novoukrayinka to keep the Ukrainian forces in place as they launched operations on the flanks. So this is a large operation in and of itself, but at the same time we see footage here in the direction of the west of Vuhledar, where it indicates that the Russians have gained full control over the fortified positions west of the settlement and are flanking the Ukrainian fortified positions in the next line. However, we see this footage showing a Ukrainian counterattack with a Leopard tanks from the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, which is located here in the direction of Vuhledar. They are the main operating force in this direction. As we can see, they are equipped with Leopard tanks, T-72s, BMP-2s, M113 armored personnel carriers, Humvees, some Soviet artillery, M109L self-propelled gun, BM-21 Grad, and M88A2 ARVs. According to this Forbes article from 2023, the 33rd Mechanized Brigade has a battalion of 32 German-made Leopard 2 tanks, including 14 of the 2A6. There's also the 90 Max Pro MRAPs. Based on this, we can conclude that the 33rd Mechanized Brigade is one of the prioritized elite brigades of the Ukrainians. These are also mostly consisting of Western trained soldiers, so they have well-trained personnel, they have good equipment, and they are actively defending, counterattacking, and preventing a Russian breakthrough. So we see that there are several advances by the Russians in the southern flank of Kurahove. At the same time, we see advances in the north, where the Russian advance here in the eastern parts of Hrynik has captured a lot of the apartment complex buildings, leaving only the southern outskirts of Hrynik under Ukrainian control, which consists of the industrial area and some residential areas. The entire apartment complex area now being under Russian control means that Hrynik is going to be in a very difficult position, and they'll likely withdraw to Kurahivka to continue their resistance. Instead, the Russians will be focusing on their flank, where they are currently fighting over Novoselidivka and Kreminna-Belka. Now that they have reached the fortified positions, it is likely they'll storm that as well, cutting off the connection between Kurahivka and Hrynik in the east to the Ukrainian positions in the west, as they continue fighting over Kreminna-Belka both from the eastern and northern directions. This is along the railways lines down to the Vovcha line. In the western direction, the Russians have stormed Novodimitrivka, gaining a foothold in the eastern outskirts, fighting over the settlement, as Russians also continue fighting over the fortified positions along the road and have captured a large portion of the road between Selydove and Novodimitrivka. The heavy fighting within Selydove continues as Russians have aligned the front line in the southern direction with both the river line in the north and the west. As expected, the Ukrainian forces here were completely cut off, with only one escape to the northern direction. This has led to the Ukrainians withdrawing from the southern direction to the northern direction, where the Russians still have fire control over the roads in the northern and western directions. So with this, the Ukrainians are now in a pocket formed here in the northern parts of Selydove, where they are preventing a Russian breakthrough in the east, while trying to withdraw from Selydove in the nighttime, under the cover of the darkness. So we see heavy fighting along the apartment complex areas in the eastern parts of Selydove, while the Ukrainians attempt to withdraw what units are left from the settlement. And heavy fighting continues on both flanks as well, as the Ukrainians try to free up the flanks, and the Russians continue tightening the gaps. At the same time, footage emerges from the top of this waste heap in the northeastern outskirts of Selydove, where this flag was planted by Russian soldiers on the top of the peak. In the northern direction by Krushy Yar, there is this located footage confirming Ukrainian attempt at a counterattack, where they managed to regain control over the waste heap northeast of Novhradivka. The attempt here is to prevent Russian offensive operations in the direction of Suchy Yar, And we see that the main efforts of the Ukrainians here is simply to disrupt the Russians as much as possible from concentrating their forces further south in the direction of Selydove and Kursk. Now that they are forced to hold their own forces in the northern parts to defend Pokrovsk and are less maneuverable, the Russians are able to redirect their forces from one section of the front line to another fairly quickly and focus their forces there. The Ukrainians are trying to force the Russians to send some troops back with these constant counterattacks, which are mainly pulled off by the Ukrainian 425th Separate Assault Battalion, as well as the 2nd Assault Battalion of the 5th Assault Brigade. Moving further north to the Sirbis River line, we see that the Russians have gained a foothold in the northern outskirts of Terny. Exactly as predicted, the Russians will focus on moving along the Sirbis River line from the north, where they recently captured Novosadove, down towards Terny and Yapolivka before they storm Tursk from the north. The Russians have a strong flank with the Sirbis River line once they capture these settlements, which will allow their forces to focus their attention on Tursk from the north and from the east. However, before the Russians can push through towards Liman, they need to clear the Serebryanki forest area here southeast of Tursk, otherwise their flank would be left exposed and the Ukrainians can attack the Russian supply lines. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will direct a lot of forces to the forest areas to clear the trenches, fortified positions, and to push the Ukrainians out of it, likely with heavier artillery and more infantry-based ammunition such as cluster munitions. Further north here in the direction of the Kursk region, there's heavy fighting continuing both in the direction of Darino Nikolaev, Darino Serelnishir, and Novoivanovka. There's a lot of conflicting information and not a lot of footage over the past few days of fighting. Therefore, we'll just leave it at this. The current situation is that the Russians are holding on to their recently captured territories at the front line, and the Ukrainians are trying to reestablish themselves here in the western outskirts, securing their flank and holding the fortified positions which is under their control to prevent further Russian breakthroughs and attempting to reopen the supply to this pocket here in the northern parts, which is being flanked by the Russian forces in the east and from the west. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.